want to have some idea of how I come down to the model I'm going to, or the chart I'm going to show you. So, the first question is based on this premise that it's possible to reduce all worldviews into four major groups based on the premise that almost all data can be reduced into a 2x2 table, and therefore if you can reduce it into a 2x2 table, you can graft it. So let me show you how this is done in medicine, and then we can sort of generalize it and move on from there. So for those of you who have not had the misfortune of seeing this table before, please don't be put off by it too much. But let me give you an example of how we use this in medicine. Let's say there's a new drug. And someone has the key to the new drug, and that's what we call the true gold standard. So someone knows what the answer is, but in fact, a study would be in which you're giving the drug, some people get the drug, and some people get a sugar pill. And theoretically, if a person gets the drug, and they have a good action to it. Let's say it's an antibiotic, or some new antibiotic. They get the drug and they get cured. Everything goes well. We would put something in here because that's a true positive. The drug worked the way it should work. But guess what? In some patients, the drug doesn't work. And so we stick data there. And so that's a mistake in one direction. Now, for the people who get the sugar pill, if the drug doesn't work, we put the data in here. And then, but guess what? There's a placebo effect. And roughly about a third, maybe even something into the low 40.
Who is the person helping with this?
He's over there.
They got it taken care of.
Oh, it's working.
Yeah,
Oh, we got it.
yeah, he's, someone had a connection for us. So thank you very much.
By the way, the Roy Branson class has invested in it. I just keep it in the trunk of my car.
So if it works the way it's supposed to work, it's over there. But you know, anywhere from up to low 40% in some studies, people get the positive effect. And so that's sort of the placebo effect. So utilizing this, for example, in a drug trial, the important thing is that there's a mistake made in this area and there's an error made in that area. And so if we look at all data, you can stick them into one of these boxes. And I didn't believe that when someone made the claim, and it's really one of the great, I think we considered him today to be one of the really outstanding people in this field. He said to me, you can reduce everything into a 2x2 box. And it took me a long time to agree with him, but as situations arose, he kept showing me how you can reduce things into a 2x2 box. I don't expect you to believe this right now, necessarily, but it's possible. Now, the reason why I want to show you this, though, is by manipulating data in this box, you can come up with something called sensitivity. By manipulating something in this box, you come up with something called specificity. Now, it doesn't make a difference how you do that, but the important concept is that with those two words, it is now possible to make a graft. So here's sensitivity and specificity. It comes from that box, and the data in that box, it can be grafted. And the reason for grafting data is that for most of us who are visual, you can see relationships and associations that you can't sort of mathematically see unless you're an extraordinary mathematician. And so everyone likes to graph things because we can see these associations and some things become inherently obvious. So the question is, if we want to graph worldview, how do we do it? And so what are the two things we would put on the axis for worldview? And I would suggest that it should be emotion and reason. And so, there are other words for that. Heart, mind, that's sort of more biblical. Education people talk about nature, nurture. I'm sure there are other words that we use to describe these two components that I think I'm roughly talking about in worldview. So how would that look? We would put emotion on one axis and reason on the other axis. And so, theoretically, in this situation, if we had a zillion worldviews and we put them in various boxes, we should be able to graft it. But I'm only talking about 4 worldviews, and so I'm going to just graph the main worldviews, and there's certain ways to do this that I don't want to go into. But I think you can see if we talk about, and this is the way it would look with the various components to it. But if we're to talk about this chart before we transfer it, let's take a look at MOPE that I would put in this quadrant. And before I talk specifically about this specific box, let me give you an example of a MOPE kind of thing in everyday life. Because people always say, well, that's okay, but give me something from everyday life. And so if you think about advertising, when I was growing up, and I think that many of you are in that age group, I used to admire someone called the Marlboro Man. He would sit there with his cigarette, Marlboro cigarette, very handsome, very rugged looking kind of guy that lived on the country. And so, I never had the desire to go out and buy a Marlboro cigarette, but a lot of people did. That was a very successful advertisement. But what was the flaw in that whole advertising? They never told you that he might get COPD or that he might get lung cancer. And of course, guess what happened to the Marlboro Man? He died of lung cancer. They didn't give you that piece of information. And so, in this type of mistake, there's frequently data that's left out. And so, I would say that the evolutionary theory that I'll talk a little bit about later on, they leave out God, more or less. And so, when you leave data out that's meaningful, you come up with different kinds of conclusions. And I think that's what has led to secular humanism, postmodernism, relativistic looking at life, but it's because they've left out part of the larger picture. So the question is, where would you graft this kind of mistake? And so I think that looking at these kinds of people, I would say these kinds of people are high on emotion and low on reason. So I would graph these people on this chart somewhere up in that corner. So, a perfect example of someone like this, and I think we have neighbors that fit into this category, is the movie industry. High on emotion, those movie stars, low on reason, generally speaking, as a whole. I don't know any movie stars, but just judging them, that's the category I would put them in. So, those kind of people I would chart up here, and those worldviews I would chart in that area. Well, how about the rules-oriented people? I would say the rules-oriented people are the ones that we should be the most acquainted with. I think that if you think about rules-oriented people, they've got, at least the ones we know, they've got all the information. They believe in God. But the thing about it is, if you have the wrong concept of who God is, then that sort of leads you into a set of errors that are totally different. Same concept, got all the information, but misinterpreting the data leads you into a different place. So, these are the two errors, and in that area, people in that area, I would place on this graph at the opposite end. High on reason, I couldn't, for when I was younger, I couldn't understand why most churches that I went into were rather cold and cold, you know. And I think that if you talk to the general young person and you ask them, why do you leave, you know, why didn't you go to church? There's nothing there for me. It's just not a fun place. Maybe kindergarten was fun, and maybe some of those earlier grades. But once you get to where the adults are, you don't just sort of sit there. They don't do much, you know. And so I think that's why I put them down there. And there's a way to estimate what the maximum values are, and that doesn't matter. But those 2 points are somewhere in these places on the graph. So anytime you have 2 points on the graph, guess what you can do? You can draw a line. So if you look at the next one, I end up drawing a line. And since that fourth group, which is a combination, is in the middle, or a combination of two, I put that in the middle. So there's actually 3 points on that graph. And this is a model I'm going to use to answer a whole bunch of questions. And so forgive me for doing this part of it, but now we're going to get into the more fun part, which are applications. And so, as you know, the book has something to do about decisions, how to make better decisions. So the first thing I'm going to address is how to make better decisions, and then I'm going to address later on some religious questions. And this chart that you've just seen will help to answer virtually, I think, almost anything you wanted to answer. Very simple chart, but let's see if it can do what I claim. But as I said, the book is based to convince people to make better choices. Now, if you look at that chart again, so I'm going to apply it to this situation. Now, this is exactly what we had before. And as I was looking at this line, and I had the opportunity to, when I first came up with this, to be working with a couple statisticians. And one of them pointed out to me, as if I didn't know it, but it didn't resonate with me. But that line is called the chance line. Anything that occurs on this line has about a 50-50 chance of being right. So if you're in this situation talking about making a decision, if you lie somewhere along that line, whatever decisions you're going to make, whether you like it or not, are going to be random. They're going to be 50% right, 50% of the time wrong. Now, what's even worse than that is that the people who occupy these areas along the chance line, many of them are actually down in this area. So the decisions they make will be worse than chance. So I claim that if you have one of these three worldviews, the likelihood of making good decisions is at best 50-50. And when I make this claim, sometimes when I'm bored out of my mind at work, and we're sort of caught up, and the residents are bored out of their mind because they have nothing to do, I will sometimes say to them, I sometimes bring some of this kind of stuff up, and I'll say something like, you know that your decision making is at best probably 50-50. And of course, they find that very offensive. Because guess what? They've spent all their lives learning how to make better decisions, right? And they're really quite specialized in making what I consider routine decisions. And so, if you can make good routine decisions, why can't you make good novel decisions? Now, and then, so I sort of point out to them, okay, what is the most important decision you're going to make in your life? And after some discussion, they all agree it's marriage. So then I ask them, what is the likelihood of first-time marriages turning out well? And it's 50-50. It's the most important decision we're going to make. We think about it, etc. And that's the best we can do is 50-50. It's a random event. And I would suggest it's random because most people in the world fall into one of these three categories. I can go on and on about this, but the idea is that if you have the wrong worldview, your decisions aren't going to turn out so great. Because all data is on this graft. You cannot hide anywhere off the graft. Everybody is somewhere on this graft. So, up in that other corner is help others worldview, or it's really, I think we can stick Jesus up there, but I don't do that in the book. I think I might have Jesus up in the corner. And if you should,
You have them up there.
and I use them as an example. I've tried to, in this book, make it secular so that you could give it to anybody who's not Christian, and they would feel comfortable reading it. But you can see that the hope worldview is to the right of that chance line. So any decisions they make are at least 50-50, and hopefully better. And the more advanced they get in that, the better they get. So if you think about Jesus, he was way up in the upper right-hand corner at 1 and 1. And I never quite understood how a grown-up man could cry. I mean, we have 2 or 3 examples of him crying. And what is relationship between someone who can cry and someone who the kids like? Well, I would suggest the relationship is that kids do not like cold people. They like people that are emotional, that can work with them. And so I would suggest to you that Jesus was likable by kids because he was an emotional guy, but perfectly balanced with reason. A very unusual combination. So he could get along with people because they liked him. Isn't it terrific to have a baby in this room? I just think it's terrific, to have real life in this room. Isn't that terrific? So anyway, that's a colleague of mine, and so I haven't seen the baby before, so I think that's pretty terrific. Anyway, so if you can imagine someone just crossing the threshold, that's worth it. It doesn't make any difference where you are. It's just crossing the threshold and you're into a different land. So anyway, this is my approach to decision making. So I'm going to go through a number of applications just to show you how I've utilized this. And I think because of shortness of time, I'm going to skip happiness, which is really a fun thing, and talk about possible associations and how things would look different if you start just grafting a whole bunch of things. And I'm going to look at philosophical movements, and I think Dr. Larson is going to probably want to correct me later on, which is okay. Political parties, governments, and you can see when you start sticking stuff up here, there are certain relationships that occur that you would not ordinarily think. For example, if we look at political movements, I don't know why it turned out that way. Let me just go on and see if I can get everything on there. Yeah. So, if we look at political movements in green, I think modernism, at least the way when I grew up, I put it down in the lower right-hand corner because I think that it's a lot of rules. I thought it was a lot of rules. I thought postmodernism is sort of in that middle category, combinations. But people really aren't sure what they believe. Anything's almost okay. And then up in the MOPE area, I put capitalism. It's sort of teapot dome and just getting what you can out of the system. I think that was so bad that obviously modernism was trying to rein in some of that freewheeling things. So, I think we might have some disagreements about this, but it's fun to now put political parties in here. And I would say the typical Republican is down here, rules-oriented, and I think we saw, with the Supreme Court thing, the Republicans were trying to get someone in there that was a strict constitutionalist. Follow the rules. On the flip side, at the opposite are the Democrats, which are pretty they're very emotional. You can see how various kinds of movements and things that they're into right now, attacking the other side. So I'd stick them up there. And when I was looking for people, I don't know. This is an old slide, so I put the Green Party in the middle, or maybe just the Libertarians that are there. I don't know. And then when I was doing countries, we'd all agree Iran's down here, very rules oriented. Until recently, until they went conservative, France was really a me first kind of country, I thought. And Sweden, I think, until recently, was, sort of didn't know what their identity was exactly. But I think the part that you might be amused is churches. I mean, where would I put the Adventist church? Well, I think I'd stick it down here with the Catholics. And I'm going to make a point right now. Episcopals aren't sure who they are, I don't think. And up there are the agnostics and Pentecostals, very emotional kinds of people, some of them. Well, what you can see is normal groupings, but the application I wanted to make with this is the problem with our church. Our church has a lot of people down here, some people up in this area, and maybe some even up there. And I think that the trouble when you get too far down at the edges of these lines is people think they're absolutely right. They become dogmatic. The only people who have some sensitivity about other people and who are willing to listen and who are more who listen and who are more cooperative are really the people up in that area. And so I think if you think about Christ, he was quite accepting of the other groups of people. He wasn't out there condemning people. And even when he talked to the Pharisees, I like the statement Mrs. White makes about him having tears in his voice. I mean, he had a certain sympathy even with people that, and I think he had sympathy because he knew they were going in the wrong direction. So anyway, I put this up there mainly to show that by grouping it, you can start to see certain things that cross over many borders. And of course, as I said, the application is to us as a church. The group, the area that I really wanted to talk about was actually our church or our religion or about God, because this is what Sabbath School is about. We're supposed to be talking about God. And so I'm going to try to answer a couple of questions. One that I used to have is why are there only two groups? Why? I always used to think that Catholics had it right. If you were pretty good, you got another chance. So I said to myself, we Adventists, of course I grew up in Adventist, I said, man, we're very rigid and we don't give much ground to people who are pretty good. So I used to think about that quite a bit. And then another question is, why is the Old Testament and New Testament so different? A question that's frequently raised, and I'm sure any theologian can answer that question easily. So I'm going to try to answer those questions not theologically, but just utilizing the graph. So if you look at the graph as I did, and I began to say to myself, although this person, this group of people and this group of people look totally different, because they're on the same line, there has to be some underlying similarities. There just has to be. And I would say one of the things that they both all enjoy is that they all think about themselves. Primarily, or first of all. I would say another thing is this what I call unproductive movement. And I'll share with you something that made sense to me. And you know, the author of The Road Less Traveled, I think we've all read that. I appreciate him because I read him at the right time in the evolution of my ideas. And so I give him credit for this illustration. He says, and I think he was I'm not sure if he's a psychiatrist or a psychologist, but he was a psychologist?
Psychiatrist.
Psychiatrist, okay. So anyway, he was a psychiatrist, and he says that when he saw patients who were way down here, pathologically, and he worked with them, and they became more healthy, guess what happened to them? They became more like people up in here. And when people were way up there and in bad condition, when they became healthy, guess what happened to them? They moved down here. So I would suggest to you that people who are along that line, that for them growth is exploration of a different part of the line. They still have the underlying characteristic of selfishness. It's about them. They don't change the basic fabric of who they are. They just manifest themselves in a different fashion. So, if you're to contrast this, and that's why I put pride there. If you look at pride and humility, I think humility is essential if you're going to really grow. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. And of course, Mrs. White makes a big thing about growth, not coupled, unless it's coupled to altruism, is not growth at all, according to her. And I agree with her thoroughly in that thing. So, as I look at this chart now, I can now answer the question, why are there only two categories? And I would suggest it's because when you look at the undersurface or underlying principles of both sides, this group is really, they look different, but they have that underlying basic fabric. And so when God judges, he only sees two groups. So that's the first question that I think this graph helped me personally to address. I'm going to skip.
Go back to that graph, Dr. Kido.
Sure.
I just wonder, can you have a chance line going the other direction from
You know,
these other two corners?
Here.
Theoretically, again, you don't know how much arguing I have done with my wife about this
Get
graph.
into that, sorry.
Everyone that's sophisticated in this room with numbers knows there should be one minus reason, and the line should be going that direction. But after much arguing with my wife, she says, no one will understand what a 1 minus is. So she says, leave that out. And so because I left that out, the line has to go this direction. But you know, it's because on the other graph, when you talk about sensitivity and specificity, it's always 1 minus specificity. And so after much discussions, I caved into my wife and left out the 1 minus idea. It opens up a whole new world, and I felt bad enough throwing in this stuff here. So anyway, you're right. It could be going in the opposite direction. So anyway, now the second question. I'm going to skip these things. Why is the Old Testament and New Testament so different? And you can see what I've done. I've put the Moat and the Old Testament together, and Rope and the New Testament together. And so my claim is that the Old Testament was written for a certain kind of people. They were a certain type of people. God talked to them a certain way. In the New Testament, there were different kind of people, the Rope kind of people. So God talked to them a different way. That God was flexible. He wasn't like us to say, it's my way or the highway. He was flexible enough to address people where they're at. And he always had in both eras, he had people that were hope people. And so there was always a contrast between the kind of persons that God would have us to become and the general principle or the general population that was out there. So within this graph, I thought it was really simple to answer that question.
Yeah, I would almost put them in opposite places.
What?
Well, it seems to me like the Old Testament is more rule-oriented, and the New Testament not so much me-oriented, but more more generalized, you know, emotional, if you will. But put, you know, the whole on these two things hang the law and the prophets. Love your neighbor as yourself. The Old Testament has a lot of detailed rules.
Yeah. I would suggest to you that the people were,
Maybe I'm not understanding.
the people were sort of wild kind of people. I mean, they were mope kind of people. And what did those kind of people need? They need rules. And so God gave them rules
Yeah.
because they were so chaotic in their behavior. I mean, they came out of slavery. They had no ideas of discipline. They had no ideas of these other kind of things. They were just undisciplined people. And so what do they need? They need rules. And so I don't, you know,
This graph is the graph of the background culture, not the graph of what God.
Right.
Okay.
And so because people were certain kinds of people, then God addressed them a certain way.
Okay.
And that's why he gave them the rules. And while down here, you know, he told some of the people down there, don't pay so much attention to the rules. He was always breaking the Sabbath according to their way of looking at the Sabbath. Why was he doing that? Because he was trying to show them that the rules they had were not the right rules, were not the right way of doing things. So anyway, for me at least, in looking at this, it helped me to understand the Bible. And so when I look at it this way within this graph, for me at least, it helped me to answer that. But anyway, getting to what I think the most fun part of this discussion is something that almost every young person says to me is, you know, here I am sincerely trying to be a good Christian. I want to choose the right profession. I pray to God, and nothing happens. It's a big problem, I think, you know. So the question is God just ignoring them? Or is God saying something to them? And so I would like to try to answer this question using the graph. Now, if we look at two people, Peter and Judas, you know, they were pretty close to God, and I think they were both sort of me first kinds of people. You know, I don't think we'd have any question about that. And I would suggest to you that after 3 years of ministry, God knew that in order to communicate to them, he needed something really drastic. And I would suggest to you that this middle zone right here, where I have the dotted line, that if I were to sort of go into detail, if you were to read the book, one of the major characteristics of that group is they can't make up their mind. They have questions. And I would say to you that if I were to look at the average college student, late high school, that's exactly where they're at. They have questions. They don't know what direction to go in. They're looking for answers. And I would suggest to you that what happened to both of these people when Christ died, you know, I mean, or when he let himself go on trial, that their whole world, their whole concept of what was going to happen was destroyed. And so guess what happened to both of them? They both moved down to this area of questioning. And what happened at that point? I would say they had a couple of choices. They could have gone down in this direction as Judas did, or they could have gone up into that hope area as Peter did. It's an area that people have to get into in order to make transitions and really create a new, to accept a new paradigm. And so I think that this transitional time or time in which we're questioning our whole self and what's happening, that is an essential part for us to go in that direction. And I frequently say to people, if God were to answer, let's say, someone who's asking for an answer, and they're a hope or rope kind of person, how would they interpret God's answer to them? Well, they would say, I must be doing the right thing. God answered my prayer. I know what to do. He spoke to me. Everything is great. So, in order to not let that confusion happen, what does God do? I would suggest to you, God keeps directing people from either direction up into this middle zone where they can question where they're at. And hopefully, in the midst of that questioning, they will move in the right direction underneath the Holy Spirit. So for me, when people say, I'm really disturbed, there's no answers, I find it that God is not interacting with me. He may be interacting in the only way he can interact with that person, and that is to push them toward the middle where they're going to ask questions. So, is it time? I'm sorry that I'm going on so long. I do the same thing at the opposite end, Paul and the rich young ruler. The rich young ruler went in one direction, I think, and Paul, of course, went in the right direction. You know, I was going to talk very briefly about how I look at this in relationship to various developmental theories, which I'm more interested in, how the brain works. And I would claim to you, as I look at these theories, that they're all false theories because they're all based on evolutionary theories. So as I look at them, they're okay to answer some of the questions, but they're based on the wrong theory. So they can't answer things as completely as I think I can answer with the theoretical model I'm going into. So if you have more time, I'll talk to you more about that. And then I'll end with this right here, and I'm sorry I've gone on so long. But next book I'm going to write is I'm going to write on history. And one of the questions I'm going to try to answer is to answer questions like suffering through that. That will amuse some people. But the important part that I want to say is next week, my wife is going to speak. I've talked her into it. and she's going to talk about a project that she's done in the past, Cognitive Genesis, and a big question that came out of Cognitive Genesis. And then she's going to talk about something that she's doing now called Decision Genesis, and what that entails and where she's going with some of her stuff right now. I think you people will be at the frontiers of education, at least as far as I'm concerned, in my own biased fashion. But I think you will enjoy that. And I have decided that I'm not going to talk about how to change. It's in the last chapter of the book. It's pretty clear. I had some other more novel things where I was going to bring in Provence and something like that. But maybe at some other time we'll talk about how to change. But I think you'll enjoy another application of how the theory can be used, this time in education. So I'm sorry I've talked so long.
No.
But,
Are there questions, answers?
Real quickly, Forrest, I just want to make a little comment. This is going to be very brief, but I would like to offer some hope to people who are getting married for the first time. I'd like to see the statisticians look at this. I think it may be that when a couple walks down the aisle, the first time they have a better than average 50-50 chance, because some people are getting divorced and remarried repeatedly, and that's throwing, if one divides the number of marriages by the number of divorces, or the other way around, it's not going to, it's going to be a different picture. So, as one who performs wedding ceremonies, I would like to be able to say you have more than a 50-50 chance of having a successful marriage.
I hate to disagree with you, but the numbers are the numbers, unfortunately. You know? But I think if a person has a right worldview, their chances go way, way high. I'd like to just, since you're speaking, and you were kind enough to put that thing about William James, I forgot to bring that up. But you know, William James and the person, what was his name that he was critiquing?
Clifford?
Clifford. You might be interested. I would put Clifford somewhere in this zone. And I don't, you know, I really appreciated what you did, because I would never have found that article by William James. I mean, How to Believe or whatever that, or I would never have seen that in 1,000 years, because that's not the areas that I work in. But it sounds like he's up here somewhere. You know, to answer the way he did. So I thought you'd be interested to see where I put them.
I have two questions.
Sure.
One is, I read the book and I follow it very clearly and very nicely. When you presented the association between the mob, me people with a specificity, sensitivity, and the raw people with a specificity. Unfortunately, I didn't see any data. I'm sure that you probably are based on some data, so that's the first question. In other words, the type 2 error is associated with one personality and the type 1 error with another one. It makes sense what you say, I mean, intuitively, but have this, I mean, have you gathered any data, I mean, to this? That's the first question.
Oh, is that the question?
That's a question, yes.
The first of all, what I've said is strictly a theoretical model. My wife will be the first one to actually test the model. And so she'll describe something next week called the Worldview Inventory, or the Worldview Inventory. That was created rather miraculously, I think. And she'll talk about, I don't want to take anything away from her next week, but we finally have a survey instrument that one can use to begin to test the model. And so I, as a scientist, would say that this is a theoretical model that was created, and now with a worldview inventory, the model can be tested.
Okay.
And so that's where we're at right now.
And the second question is, on what basis you have equated sensitivity to emotion and specificity to reason? I don't see an explanation in the book.
There is no relationship. It's just to demonstrate that how you can take data. That was just an example to show people how you can take data and make it and go from numbers to a graph. And so that was just strictly an illustration to show that you can take material and instead of just talking about numbers, you can put it onto a graph where you can begin to visually inspect it. So I tried to make that clear, and obviously I didn't do as good a job as I did, but it was strictly an illustration. The accuracy was strictly an illustration to show that you can graph material and how to go about doing that.
Right here.
Sorry, I got a question and a comment. The first question is, what is the sort of statistical result when you compare the people that claim to embrace hope in terms of divorce? Last time I looked at it, there was no difference. So, you know, what does embracing that do in terms of the statistical analysis? Is it really make a big difference in divorce rates? My understanding was it doesn't. The second comment was emotion and reason are something that exist within our brains in two different areas. So we have the amygdala and sort of prefrontal cortex with competing reason versus emotion. So individuals never really are in either of those ends of the spectrum. We make decisions based on either emotion or reason at different times and different decisions. So to resolve it to just simply plotting on a point on a graph, I think is too simplistic to be useful. Your comment?
I agree with you that most decisions have some emotion in them. Some have a lot of emotion, some have less emotion. I think that I consider myself to be a neuroscientist, and I think of some of the things that you say are correct. But I think that it's to show that one group is dominated by one more than the other. And so, and I would disagree with you to say that the Hope people's marriages turn out as badly as the people on the dotted line. I don't think anyone has ever had, I would say that from a factual standpoint, that the inventory, the worldview inventory that's been created is the first one that's ever been created. There is no one else that has tried to create a worldview inventory of the nature like this. And that was told to us by someone that's very, very experienced in these kind of things. It's a novel idea. And so I think to test that kind of idea, it's the first time that some of the things I'm saying are going to be testable. And so I think that the future is quite bright to test this whole matrix idea. And I would suggest to you that this whole thing that I'm talking about is really, I think, a biblical model. I mean, I don't take much credit for this thing. It's really a guy who had the opportunity to have a lot of outcomes research background. I have had the fortune of really working with a lot of people like that. I've had the good fortune to be in the neuroscience field, having a lot of religion classes. And I think that this is what I would consider to be a biblical model. And I don't show you the last slide, but basically the last slide, and I guess it's time for us to quit.
We've got one more question here.
Okay. On the last slide, basically what I say is that I use this model and that I don't have to resort back to the evolutionary model to answer a lot of the questions that I have. That this model is sufficiently powerful that I can use it to answer just about anything I want to ask. Yes?
I may have missed it, so you may need to reiterate it. What standard do you use for that something's the right decision, as opposed? Now, marriage, you're using whether they stay together or not, but that may not be the right decision.
You know, I think in all outcome research, it's really the outcome. I mean, to me, that's the only way to judge anything. It's what if you say something, what results do you get from what you say?
I mean, my feeling is it should be happiness.
What was that?
Happiness of going over there. But,
I have a whole talk on happiness that I purposely excluded because I thought people would be more interested in happiness than decision making. But
their decisions lead to happiness.
But I would suggest to you that happiness is not what whole people are after. I think people on the dotted line are after happiness. I would say hope people are much more after satisfaction.
Which could be the same thing.
Satisfaction could have some things going with it, but I would say the martyrs that were being burned at the stake weren't so happy. But I think that they were probably satisfied that they had made the right choice. I think it's 11:30. And I'd be happy to answer any question. I think this whole model, whenever I present it, it's really a very provocative idea. And I would say that it's an evolutionary kind of thing as far as I'm concerned. I think the real hard data is going to start coming in. And my wife will tell you a little bit about what she's doing, which is really the first real pieces of hard data that are going to come in as far as I'm concerned.
Well, Dr. Kido, thank you so much again. And I know you're a wise man because you said you adjusted your chart because of your wife's comments.
Many times.
But and we're looking forward to hearing from your wife next week. Thank you very much. Our Oh, just before we have our benediction, remember the folks up there in Paradise? Really, I guess it's really war zones with the damage, so remember that. Let's do our benediction. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace.